It's my privilege to introduce the two fabulous women who will be leading us off. And the first is Patricia Beattie Jung. She will be speaking on God Sets the Lonely in Families. She is professor of Christian ethics and professor of health and welfare at St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City, Missouri. She is the author of too many books for me to list. In 1993, Heterosexism, an Ethical Challenge, and a number of really interesting edited books, including God, Science, Sex and Gender, an Interdisciplinary Approach to Christian Sexual Ethics, published in 2010. And Joan Martin will be responding to her, the Reverend Joan Martin, who is the William Rankin Associate Professor of Christian Social Ethics at the Episcopal Divinity School. She has written a number of books, including More Than Chains and Toil, A Christian Work Ethic of Enslaved Women, an edited collection for Your Daughters Shall Prophesy, Feminist Alternatives in Theological Education, and her most recent essay published is Women's Work is Never Done, Women's Low-Wage Labor and Struggles for Moral Agency. And I asked her especially what she would like for me to say, if I could say anything at all, and it was that she is pleased to be here and to have an ecumenical conversation as a Presbyterian minister coming from an Episcopal Divinity School about same-sex marriage and Catholicism. And I think that's a good place to start. Welcome both of these fine women, please.
God sets the lonely in families. If you didn't recognize it, that's part of Psalm 68. There are three interrelated parts to my remarks this afternoon. I'll be wrestling with arguments first about homosexual activity and second about same-sex marriage. In a third, shorter section, I will argue for the civil promotion of marriage equality. Catholics believe that moral judgments should cohere with sound interpretations of the Bible and the living Christian tradition, but we also believe the reasonableness of our moral arguments should be evident to all persons, regardless of their faith or lack thereof. So it's precisely to such tests, to canons of reason like consistency, comprehensiveness, and coherence with scientifically documented evidence, that I will put official Catholic teachings. This seems especially fitting since our focus today is on the civil licensing, not the blessing, of same-sex marriages. So, part one, the morality of homosexual activity. Officially, the Church teaches that homosexual activity is always immoral. The bishops give three reasons for its proscription. In their view, such activity, 1, is closed to God's gift of life, 2, does not proceed from a genuine form of complementarity, and 3, violates natural law. Undoubtedly, over the centuries, many Catholics, as well as their confessors and some of their bishops, may have disagreed with this judgment and failed to find the reasoning behind it compelling. There may have even been many quiet, sotto voce, conversations among the bishops and between theologians and local bishops about this topic. But it was not until the 1970s that these theological conversations went public. And we need to thank John McNeil for bringing that conversation out in the open. I am delighted to be here today and to have this chance to speak publicly myself about this issue. I wish to thank Paul Lakeland and Michael for their vision, and the Yale Divinity School Subcommittee for planning this event and particularly for Margaret Farley for her commending me, and for Michael for his incredible hospitality. Thank you. So, on the topic of homosexuality, let me begin by saying homosexual couples can be open to the gift of life. Pope Paul VI taught that, quote, each and every marriage act must remain open to the transmission of life. This meant to him that only coital activities are permitted. It follows that all oral, anal, manual, intercurral forms of genital activity to the point of orgasm are forbidden to everyone, gay or straight. For the same reason, contraception is proscribed. While a natural form of family planning, sexual abstinence during times of fertility is permitted to heterosexual couples, contraception is not. Only sexual abstinence, indeed lifelong sexual abstinence, is permitted to gay people, again for the same reason. At first glance, church officials seem to be quite consistent. But note that church officials do not condemn the sexual activity or oppose the marriage of pregnant women, postmenopausal women, or of men who are permanently infertile. And yet all of their sexual activity, whether coital or not, would be biologically closed to procreation. In fact, the bishops teach that there are many ways that infertile heterosexual couples can and should express their openness to God's gift of life. In addition to adopting children in need of homes, infertile couples are encouraged, quote, to care for those who are needy, disabled, pushed to the margins of society, and by their support for and participation in works of charity and justice, close quote, serve life. Why could gay and lesbian couples not do the same? What makes coital infertility natural and non-coital infertility unnatural? This is a question that is key to the debate. The bishops answer it this way. Coitus, even when non-reproductive, is iconic of the call to serve life. Their argument goes like this. Only coitus can be open to the gift of life. Only heterosexual couples can engage in coitus. So only heterosexual couples can symbolically embody this call. I am the mother of 3 wonderful sons, and my husband and I now delight in 5 grandchildren. But I think this notion that only heterosexual couples can signify the calling to serve life through their sexual relationships is mistaken. My reasons are several. All heterosexual couples do not biologically symbolize openness to the possibility of procreation. Look at me. No one links older postmenopausal women, heterosexual or not, with biological openness to the possibility of procreation. 2, openness to the possibility of procreation is not essential to morally good sex. Reproduction is clearly sexual, and reproduction is clearly essential to the flourishing of our species. But if we take all the biological facts of human embodiment seriously, then it becomes clear that while there is a link between reproduction and sexuality at the level of the species, there is no essential connection at the level of acts or relationships. 3 reasons confirm this. First, like many other species, humans are, biologically speaking, constantly receptive to and initiating of sexual activity. We do not heat up only on an estrus cycle, only or always for reproductive purposes. Second, some reproductive organs, like the uterus, have no sexual function. Some sexual organs have no reproductive function. While the ejaculation of sperm is usually tied to male orgasm, female sexual pleasure has no connection to ovulation. Though its role in the production of sexual pleasure may indirectly facilitate reproduction, the clitoris is biologically not necessary to it. In fact, one evolutionary biologist has suggested that the clitoris may be positioned where it is in human females, precisely so as to facilitate her sexual pleasure through both coital and non-coital contact, potentially with either same or other sex partners. Third, homogenital behavior has been documented in over 450 species, including primates. It is commonplace in nature. Of course, this alone does not mean that it is normatively natural. But by expanding the reach of its bonding function, such diversity in sexual behavior enables species to extend kin-like ties and child-rearing partnerships, resolve power conflicts, and respond with greater flexibility to environmental stresses associated with overpopulation. Evolution favors survival, and survival is facilitated by forms of mating that can both include and exclude breeding as necessary. The bonding and procreative meanings of sexuality need not be inseparably connected in order for sexual activity to be morally good. The U.S. bishops have argued that, quote, without its ordering toward procreation, the unitive meaning of marriage is undermined, close quote. Again, I've been married for over 36 years, and while these purposes have been connected on several occasions, for the most part, they have not. In our experience, their separation did not undermine our ability to make love. It did not erode our fidelity or our mutual concern and respect. Neither did the practice of contraception lead us down a sexually libertine path. You'll be relieved to know. Yet all of these consequences, which church officials predicted, would follow contraception in marriage. Now, I recognize that my husband's and mine experience of married life is no sure source of moral wisdom. But though personal, our interpretation of the practice of contraception within marriage is certainly not unique to us. Most heterosexual Catholics in the United States practice birth control. Currently, only about 2% of Catholic women rely on natural family planning, and 68% use highly effective methods of contraception. And this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Of course, I know that just because everybody's doing it, that doesn't make it right either. Despite our clear consciences, all of us lay, married, heterosexual Catholics who live along the North Atlantic could be wrong. This could be an expression of sin. Alternatively, it could be a sign of the Spirit leading the people of God deeper into the truth about human sexuality. It can be reasonably countered that the bishops need to pay more attention to the sexual experience of faithful Catholics of all sexual stripes. Their claim about the inseparable connection between the unitive and procreative meanings of sexual activity has not been well received. It does not enjoy what theologians call the sense of the faithful, whether they are straight or gay. And according to Catholic doctrine, such reception is an important sign of sound teaching. In response to the distress of thousands of faithful lay heterosexual Catholics, when in the late 60s the condemnation of contraception was reiterated by Pope Paul VI, some bishops' conferences around the globe, including the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, took the occasion to remind Catholic confessors and lay people of the absolute priority of the faithful Catholic's conscience. It has long been a matter of Catholic doctrine that each person has an obligation to form their conscience well and to follow its dictates, even if the bishops think they're mistaken. In a set of pastoral guidelines which focus on contraception, the Vatican recommends that confessors, quote, inspire all in a gradual way to embrace the path of holiness, to recognize that, quote, frequent relapse into sins of contraception does not in itself constitute a motive for denying absolution, and to let penitents remain in good faith whenever it is foreseen that the penitent, although oriented towards living within the bounds of the life of faith, would not be prepared to change his own conduct. Close quote. It may well be in the best of parishes that confessors respond with pastoral respect to both heterosexual and homosexual couples who in good conscience have wrestled with but reject this emphasis on procreativity. But the Church has not publicly announced the priority of conscience to her distressed gay and sons and lesbian daughters, or offered an analogous pastoral guidelines to confessors regarding homosexuality. Furthermore, while this so-called contraceptive mentality is still decried in official teachings, it is no longer attacked in the political arena, at least in the United States. There has been no recent serious effort to ban the sale or distribution of contraceptives, nor any lobbying effort to advocate that marriage licenses be withheld from straight couples who intentionally plan to be child-free. The bishops seem to have concluded that for all practical purposes, while the horses left the barn in regard to contraception in the United States, gay couples can still be singled out. We shall discuss why in a moment they believe this is legitimate, but let me summarize part one of my argument up to this point. I contend that homosexual activity can be open to and serve life in precisely the same way that the biologically infertile heterosexual activity of a postmenopausal woman like myself can welcome the gift of life. Openness to the possibility of procreation is not essential to good sex. Lovemaking need not be inseparably connected to potentially baby-making activities in order to be morally good. Homosexual activity can be genuinely complementary. A comparative newcomer, complementarity only recently became foundational to Catholic sexual ethics. Catholic officials presume that while persons are complete in themselves as individuals, insofar as humans are made to form intimate sexual partnerships, we are incomplete and need to partner with someone who complements us. So far, so good. But here's the rub. The bishops teach further that the only normatively natural human orientation is heterosexual, so only partners of the opposite sex can be complementary. For this reason, continued political efforts to curtail homosexual behavior are warranted. According to the bishops, gay, male, and lesbian relationships cannot be truly loving. If, however, in contrast, diversity in sexual orientation is presumed to be normatively natural, then genital complementarity would vary in accord with the orientation of an individual's desire. In this framework, complementarity would not require a partner of the opposite sex, but rather one of the apposite sex, as in apt. Apt for what, you ask? Apt for making love and forging bonds through the mutual sharing of sexual delight. This is possible only in relationship with someone of the apposite sex. Both sides of the debate about complementarity take their respective premise to be axiomatic. So the decisive issue here becomes who bears the burden of proof. As Psalm 104 and the scriptures in general testify, our Creator delights in and treasures diversity. Presuming difference to be a disorder without compelling evidence is an offense against God. Furthermore, for decades now, scientists have challenged accounts of heterogenital normativity that suggest complementarity is possible only between the sexes. They have detailed the tremendous range of physical and psychological variability within each gender, as well as the huge overlapping similarities between the sexes. Social scientific studies of committed same-sex relationships indicate that they evidence emotional qualities as well as stability and satisfaction rates similar to long-term heterosexual relationships. The weight of evidence suggests that both heterosexual and homosexual partnerships can be complementary. The comprehension of such data requires an account of complementarity that is more holistic than the heterosexist version adopted by the bishops. Homosexual acts can be natural in a normative sense. As you might well have guessed by now, church officials teach that homosexual acts are unnatural for two reasons. First, because they are biologically close to the possibility of procreativity, and second, because they are presumed not to be genuinely complementary, and therefore incapable of being genuinely lovemaking. I've already refuted those two lines of argument, noting the capacity of same-sex relationships to serve both life and love. But I would raise here a concern I have about the unjustified use of labels like unnatural. Teachers of the church, myself included, are privileged with a grave responsibility. When and if we use terms like unnatural, we are sanctifying the internalization of profoundly negative self-understandings by some in our community, as well as hateful attitudes towards those in that same group. To employ such language without justification is to betray the trust that has been placed in us as teachers of the church. We, the bishops and theologians, are morally responsible for the personal and social impact of our teachings. Part 2 of my argument, official Catholic teachings on marriage equality. It comes as no surprise that the Church is presently unwilling to bless or recognize the sacramental character of same-sex marriages. The Church does not do this for divorced heterosexual couples who seek to remarry without a declaration of annulment of their previous marriage. And yet, as was pointed out this morning, the U.S. bishops do not currently lobby against or politically oppose the civil licensing of even multiple remarriages for heterosexual couples. Given that the Church condemns and refuses to bless both practices, both remarriage without annulment and same-sex marriage, why are its legislative recommendations regarding marriage equality so different? This is a second key question to this debate. The contemporary case for differential treatment in general of gay and lesbian people was first articulated by the Vatican in 1992, but it was not until 2000 that Rome opposed domestic partnerships and the licensing of same-sex marriages by name. This was followed 3 years later by another specific Vatican condemnation. Then, in his 2005 New Year's Eve address, an occasion when pontiffs traditionally identify the greatest challenges facing humanity in the coming year, Pope John Paul II identified the challenge to life, particularly in its beginnings, to be his top concern. This did not prove remarkable until he went on to argue that life was threatened in its sanctuary, the family, by legislative challenges to exclusively heterosexual structures of marriage. In 2005, the Pope identified marriage equality as more dangerous to life than hunger, war, or tyranny. In 2009, the U.S. bishops identified at length the reasons for such vehement opposition to marriage equality. I contend that marriage equality will not harm marriage. This was the first of the bishops' reasons. So the argument is structured along their reasoning. It is clear that marriage is an institution in North Atlantic countries that is undergoing a tremendous transformation, and that in general fewer people are choosing to marry. Church officials assert that the licensing of same-sex marriages will contribute to its further deterioration as an institution. How so? The bishops are not specific here. one could hypothesize that the small number of gay spouses who have closeted themselves in heterosexual marriages may find the normalization of homosexuality signified by marriage equality sufficient encouragement for them to come out of the closet. This might well result in them divorcing their heterosexual spouse, though it does not always do so now. But this small rise in the divorce rate would most likely be a temporary phenomenon at most, since closeting in straight marriages would quickly grow uncommon, as would the divorces attributable to such suffocation. In any case, this number of divorces is likely to be heavily outweighed by the number of currently cohabiting lesbian and gay couples who would marry if they could. One could hypothesize that marriage equality might contribute to a rise in the divorce rate for other reasons, but studies suggest not. As Lisa noted earlier, the CDC has reported that all 5 of the states that allow same-sex marriage in 2007 had divorce rates that were nearly 20% lower than the rest of the country. This does not establish a causal relationship, but it is encouraging. A study of demographic data drawn from the 8 countries that gave significant rights to the legally registered same-sex couples between 1989 and 2000 is equally encouraging. If, in fact, as the bishops suggest, the sky is going to fall when same-sex marriages are licensed, then in these countries across the globe, the rate for first marriage should have declined, while divorce and cohabitation and non-marital birth rates should have climbed. All of this happening in tandem with the change in public policies to legitimize marriage equality. But in fact, this did not happen. For the same reason, there should be notably different trends regarding the health of marriages in countries that do not recognize same-sex marriage. But reviews of relevant demographic data again indicate that this is not true. There is no documented evidence that the civil recognition of same-sex marriage has or will harm marriage as an institution. Another reason the bishops give for opposing marriage equality is that it will harm the dignity of persons. I contend again that marriage equality will not harm the dignity of persons. The bishops argue that marriage protects and promotes the dignity of persons, of men, women, and children, teaching them and society at large that our value is God-given. People deserve respect regardless of their social, political, or economic utility. The bishops argue that any force that would harm marriage and the view of personal worth that marriage nurtures would then threaten human dignity itself. Since the bishops believe marriage equality will harm the institution of marriage, they concluded it will threaten human dignity. But as just noted, there is no evidence to support either of these claims. Another argument against marriage equality developed by the bishops is that it will harm children. Church officials teach that the legalization of same-sex marriage will harm children in 2 ways. In contrast, I contend that support for sexual authenticity via marriage equality will not harm children. Implicit in the Vatican's 1992 directives was the assumption that homosexual people are especially prone to seduce those who are young and vulnerable, to recruit those whose sexual desires may waver, or worse, to be abusive sexual predators. I won't honor this line of argument further, except to say that there is not a shred of evidence for such a vicious stereotype. Currently, however, Rome is making a more subtle claim, arguing that legal support for same-sex marriage will prove morally confusing. As the Vatican put it in 2003, such a scandalous, and this is a technical term in ethics, practice will give young people and others, quote, erroneous ideas about sexuality and marriage that would deprive them of their necessary defenses and contribute to the spread of the phenomenon, close quote. It makes sense for Rome to judge the pedagogical power of marriage equality legislation harmful, given their convictions that homosexuality is disordered. But the message sent by marriage equality is not confusing, and it's not unclear, nor is it mistaken. Certainly, the approval of same-sex marriage will be socially transformative. Laws clearly can be morally formative. Might the licensing of same-sex marriages lessen the social pressure on homosexual people to closet themselves, to despise themselves? I certainly hope so. Far from being corrosive, when same-sex marriage is licensed, people will find it easier to live sexually authentic lives. Ironically, the U.S. bishops commended precisely such sexual integrity when they taught that we all need to integrate, quote, our thoughts, feelings, and actions in the area of human sexuality in a way that values and respects one's own dignity and that of others as children of God, close quote. The bishops argue that same-sex parenting will harm children. I contend it will not. The Vatican teaches, quote, as experience has shown, the absence of sexual complementarity in these unions creates obstacles to the moral development of children who would be placed in the care of such parents. Allowing children to be adopted by persons living in such unions would actually mean doing violence to these children, close quote. The most charitable way to interpret this claim by the Vatican would be to say that by violence, the Vatican meant to say that same-sex parenting would not be conducive to the full human development of children. And were this to be true, it would indeed be a cause for concern. But despite the Vatican's assertion that their claim was based in experience, after more than 20 years of scrutiny, not a single research study suggests that children raised by same-sex parents fail to flourish. Indeed, as early as 1999, literature reviews had given clear evidence to the contrary. Data from one among the latest of these studies was published this summer. This multi-year comparative study of 106 school-aged children living in different parts of the United States found that children adopted by lesbian and gay couples are thriving and developing normally, including in regard to their gender identity. Another argument that is sometimes raised by some bishops is that marriage equality will promote sexual anarchy. And we looked at an earlier version of this morning as well. I contend that it will not. Because it was signed by a few members of the Catholic magisterium and drafted by a prominent East Coast theologian, a concern unique to the document known as the Manhattan Declaration merits our brief attention. According to this document, the recognition of same-sex marriage will put society on a slippery slope, leading to the moral validation of incestuous and/or polygamous marriages and all manner of wild, including bestial sexual behavior. There is simply no logical or experiential connection between, on the one hand, promoting monogamy, relational stability, shared economic responsibility, the taking up of legal duties and other disciplines associated with marital promises, and sexual licentiousness, on the other hand. As John Corvino put it, the charge doesn't stick. Finally, the bishops are arguing that marriage equality will unduly violate religious liberty. I contend that not to be true. The U.S. bishops rightly note that, quote, the legal protection of marriage as the union of one man and one woman also protects the religious freedom of those who adhere to that vision of marriage, close quote. Two comments seem to be on order. First, the bishops do not note that marriage inequality denies the religious freedom of those who do not adhere to their vision of marriage. Second, though it is not likely that states will force priests to preside at same-sex marriages, even with generous protections and exemptions, in some cases, as has already been evident on the East Coast, those who dissent from marriage equality may have to pay a price for their beliefs. We should always have very good reasons for exacting such a toll on our neighbors. And I will detail those very good reasons in part 3 of this argument. But let me summarize part 2 for you before I get to that. In 1965, at the Second Vatican Council, the Church developed a new approach to civil law and to religious freedom. The Council declared the inviolability of human dignity of each and every person, and that it mandated that we respect individual freedom of conscience. This freedom should be curtailed, and I quote, only when and insofar as necessary, close quote, according to Vatican II. Individual freedom of conscience itself was officially recognized as an important constituent of the common good. But of course, it is not the only constituent. There must be limits to human liberty. But note the import of this new starting point. The burden of proof, according to Vatican II documents, falls on those who would restrict freedom. A careful review of the evidence, in my opinion, suggests that, in fact, the civil recognition of same-sex marriages will not harm the institution of marriage, nor the dignity of persons nurtured therein. Neither will it harm children, nor promote a slide into sexual anarchy. Whether the few restrictions on religious liberty it imposes are excessive will be addressed in a minute. Since it falls on those who wish to withhold marriage licenses to bear the burden of proof, and since that burden has not been met, the bishop's teachings about civil legislation in this regard should be rejected. As the Catholic Catechism itself makes clear, Only justified instances of differential treatment should ever be tolerated. All unjust discrimination against homosexual people should be condemned. Part 3, promoting marriage equality. For the most part, the case for marriage equality is the same as the case for marriage in general. Evidence suggests that marriage serves the common good, particularly by assisting spouses and children. It follows then that those not called by God to life and community or singleness, but who instead are drawn into love relationships and/or toward parenting, ought to marry. I want to be clear that I'm not making an argument that marriage or parenthood be compulsory, but rather commending marriage to those who are lovers and parents. Marriage is good for most spouses most of the time. It's associated with reduced rates of drug abuse, longer life expectancy, especially for men, lower rates of domestic violence, less criminal activity, fewer sexually transmitted diseases. Spouses are on average healthier, happier, and safer. Spouses help each other cope with life's ups and downs. They can help each other deal with unemployment, accept loss, survive accidents and illnesses, live with chronic disease, negotiate life with disabilities, endure growing diminishment in one's capacities, help each other age gracefully, enjoy retirement, and in the case of one spouse, die well. All of these forms of mutual assistance are true for gay as well as straight marriages. The state encourages people to marry because it does not just serve individuals involved, but stretches those spouses to think beyond their private interests. Marriage connects spouses to children and to other kin in ways that they are not able to just walk away from. Society encourages marriage because such expanded interests and commitments benefit society as a whole. All of this is just as true for gay marriage as it is for straight. For example, on average, married parents are best able to create a stable environment for the nurture of children. Married parents can spell each other when the demands of child rearing become overwhelming. They bring complementary, mutually enhancing skills to the process. The promotion of same-sex marriage will help children already being raised by gay parents to further stabilize their partnerships. This would enable children from an estimated 150,000 households in the United States to receive automatically all the medical and dental care benefits, the Social Security benefits, the hospital visitation and inheritance rights, and the educational benefits for which they would be eligible from both of their parents if they were married. The state promotes marriage by associating this estate with a wide variety of economic and legal benefits. Despite claims made by the bishops to the contrary, at least in the U.S., some rights and benefits accrue only to family members: workplace benefits, joint income tax status, the right to make medical decisions in the absence of written instructions. I'm running out of time, so I just want to bring up one other reason to support same-sex marriage. As I noted in the beginning, the reasons for supporting marriage equality are the same as promoting and supporting marriage in general. But I would give an additional rationale in our context. marriage equality may reduce the social stigma and internalized shame associated with being gay. In the long run, marriage equality may even reduce hate crimes. Despite the recent national decline in violent crime, in my hometown in Kansas City, Missouri, between 2009 and 2010, the hate crime rate increased by 52%. This is probably attributable to the increased visibility of gay and lesbian people in the Midwest. When marriage equality is normalized, it would be reasonable to expect that both the homophobia and the heterosexism reinforced by arguments against same-sex marriage will begin to wither. And with that withering, it is my hope that we see a decline in the stigma, shame, and crimes that spew from these views. Thank you very much for your attention.
I want to thank the organizing committee here at Yale Divinity School for this conference, and to those persons with great forethought, to Paul Lakeland and Christine Henze, to Patrick Hornbeck, Kelby Harrison, and Michael Norco, and especially to Michael for not only his hospitality, but his nurture to get some of us, meaning moi, here. This is an important conversation, in large part a great conversation in 4 settings, and this third one I'm very pleased to be here for. And although I am a mature voice on sexual diversity, I am pleased and honored to be in this conversation, particularly talking about same-sex marriage and the Catholic Church, one I've not had an opportunity to speak on before, and to come with a different voice, particularly as one from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I want to thank Pat overall for her paper, because very rarely do I get a paper with which there is not one thing with which I disagree. And that is not to say that things are wonderful, but it is to say that there is, in fact, a new consensus arising, and I'm glad to be made aware of this from lay persons and from, I know, selected clergy in the Roman Catholic Church. So let me address just a few issues, not in any way of criticism, but to just expand or to put in my own words some particular issues that I think are important. In the first section of Patricia's paper, she speaks to the question about the morality of homosexuality, and that in the doctrine of the Catholic Church, homosexuality and homosexual acts in particular have always and are still considered immoral. The question has been put this way: are they closed to God's gift of life? That's my rendering from a statement that Pope Paul VI said when he stated that each and every marriage act must remain open to the transmission of life. And Patricia has gone on to talk about what that means in terms of coital activities for heterosexual couples in marriage, and for expressions of openness to God's gift of life for those who do not participate in that particular sexual expression of openness, that is in child adoption, care for those who are needy, disabled, or those pushed to the margins of society, and by their support in the participation in works of charity. The underlying argument for this is that all heterosexual couples in marriage do not biologically symbolize openness to the possibility of procreation. Well, first, Patricia, let me say that no one would most likely think that or link older women who happen to be lesbian with such expressions of openness either to God's gift of life, and nor would anyone most likely have linked, like my very gay brother when he was 72 years old, with such openness to life. Now, I think that that's wonderful that in the consensus that is growing, that in fact is just a mirror. That there are all sorts of expressions of openness to life. And what I am intending to say with this is purposeful. That is, I'd like to suggest that a way to separate these very significant several issues that you have spoken of from the inseparability in the doctrine regarding coitus, reproductive sex, and the unitive purposes of marriage for heterosexuals is to reverse the notions that procreation of life is the primary purpose of marriage, and that oneness, that is biological oneness of male and female, sex organs constitutes the necessary unitive purpose at a variety of levels. Rather, as I have maintained for a number of years, and that Kelly Brown Douglas has recently written about in the book she and Marvin Ellison have edited, Sexuality and the Sacred, we ought to think theologically that love of the other, not the individual other, but of the other outside of self, is the generative principle of life, whether of children or of broader expressions of the transmission of life. That is to say that the meaning of life that I think you are most elegantly suggesting, both in the Catholic tradition and in the larger Christian tradition, is one that is not confined to the material creation of children per se, as heterosexual offsprings, but that the bringing into being of love, that is the imago Dei, and caring for that which most likely does not exist in most places in our contemporary world, is in fact the principle that God is love rather than God is life. Sometimes I've been accused of being an idolatrous Bible Protestant. But that is to say that I understand that the first principle of the first creation story is that God's love was so overwhelming that God created something for God's love to have purpose. Or as it is in the Gospel of John, God so loved the world that God gave God's only Son. The meaning of incarnation. Love is given through life, but that love, at least God's love, exists before life. And later on in that same gospel, for as contentious as it is interpreted that the life of Jesus means that I came that they may have love and have life and have it abundantly. Love precedes the priority of life, particularly from God's perspective. Second, you argue very forcefully in response to reproduction is clearly sexual and reproduction is clearly essential to the flourishing of the species. And you go on to say, but if we take all the facts of human embodiment seriously, then it becomes clear that while there is a link between reproduction and sexuality, at the level of the species, there is no essential connection at the level of acts or relationship. So next, let me say, thank God eroticism is not limited to monthly cycles. My humor notwithstanding, I take seriously the underlying claim of the bishops and other marriage traditionalists, and I do not want to isolate the bishops and the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. We got plenty of folks in Protestantism who make the same claims, just on different grounds, but some similar. I want to take seriously the underlying claim of marriage traditionalists that mistake biological difference per se for social constructions of dual gender complementarity that is hierarchical and essentialist. Gender and complementarity become the new, more subtle forms of assumptions about sexual otherness of male and female necessary for bonding, of social structuring in the family and of the family, in the economic sphere, political, military spheres, and the ecclesia. We oftentimes ruin that wonderful metaphor for Christ and the church as the essence of the relationship between God and God's people. Rather than marriage traditionalists challenging their own Western assumptions about heteronormative monogamy as naturalized by dominant interpretive thought and discourse, feminist, womanist, LGBTQ, justice liberationists' perspectives are derided as destroying the family and society and are therefore immoral. Yet these very perspectives instead promote not a destruction of family and society, but a mutuality of caring, long-term commitment grounded not in sexual hierarchy, but in the equality of legal, relational, economic, social, and the fullest possibilities for, as an ethicist, a thing that I think is incredibly important, the moral agency of both partners for their relationship and for their life in the world. You also have a great way of saying some reproductive organs, like the uterus, have no sexual function, and then there are some sexual organs that have no reproductive function. Yippee. Clearly, you help us to see that there is no way for me to expand on that observation, let alone disagree with it. The fact of full moral and sexual embodiment, particularly female embodiment, seems to elude those who believe that sex is foremost for procreation and therefore only within heterosexual traditional marriage. In the latter view, LGBTQ people are fundamentally defined not as persons, and I come from a history of people who already know a lot about that for hundreds of years. So in that sense, women remain subtly defined and socially structured by male definitions of what human means, what sexuality means, and by male ownership and moral agency, and not women on their own. What's unspoken is that heterosexual men, too, are seen as lacking full, mature sexual and moral agency, and so must be constrained in that great 19th century Victorian sexuality and Republican, with a small r, constrained boundary of compulsory hierarchical heterosexual marriage. And then third, you speak of the homogenital behavior that has been documented in over 450 species, including primates. One of the things that I think is really important is that you say evolution favors not just breeding, but survival mechanisms. And survival requires forms both of mating and of those which exclude breeding as necessary. To that point, I have to make a moment of witness. I have a 15-year-old goddaughter who was birthed by a crack mother in Texas and is now beautifully black and African American and courageously transgendered, and has brought me to deeply and personally understand that phenomena. She is gender nonconforming, one of the new languages I've learned, and I can only imagine when you support marriage equality, it's not just about gays and lesbians, but it's for people like my goddaughter. And so what you say is very, very important. I also want to raise then the issues just very briefly that you bring up in your second full category. Homosexual activity can be genuinely complementary. It is important to understand that I think, once again, here we need to see that your point about the desire of same-sex persons for opposite sex, that which is apt in circumstances or relationships, is in keeping with natural law. When terms of natural become more in keeping with a dynamic and evolving understanding of both the notions of human being, human beingness, and that which constitutes natural, an abiding problematic of natural law moral theology in every generation. It is still contested, and those terms are still contested, rather than seeing the dynamic meaning of human beings have a sense of ever-evolving persons and a species created by God. This is much like what Episcopal historian Richard Norris was developing from his understanding of Thomistic law in order to bridge the divide between marriage traditionalists and their interpretation of the Bible and more progressive and liberationist interpreters of the Bible before his untimely death a number of years ago, and a person and his writings to whom Margaret Farley wrote a very wonderful statement about the need to look at human beingness. Indeed, such notions yield more than a dynamic and less than static and non-universalist perspective. They may, in fact, help us to understand that the universalistic comes through understanding difference and particularity. And so I see that as part of what you have shared with us and found that very important. I won't go on to say much more because it's time for people to, in fact, engage you in questions, but I do want to point to some particularly important questions that move us beyond even as we focus on this question about marriage equality. I know that you are familiar, and many in the room are familiar with the work of Marvin Ellison, my good colleague and Presbyterian clergy person. He raises some very important things for us, particularly as ethicists, to think about in Chapter 7 of his book, Same-Sex Marriage, a Christian Ethical Response. He first reminds us that we're going to have to ask the hard question about marriage as vocation, something that we choose. And as we choose it, there are still those who may not have real choice. And this is not only amongst gays and lesbians and bis and transgendered persons, but also amongst heterosexual persons. I can't count the number of women in the churches who have had to make a false choice because they wanted to have children to have to get married. Now, it seems to me we have to do better at understanding marriage as vocation and a more elaborate and complex understanding of free choice, theologically and ethically. Not long ago, I was in Washington, D.C. with the Metropolitan Community Church, euphemistically known as the Gay Church. And while sitting on a panel with Tracy West talking about violence has come home to roost in the church vis-a-vis the Eddie Long scandal, the question about multiple partners was raised in one session where the constructs of even marriage equality for LGBT folks was put into question. Now, that's not saying that LGBT folks should not have the civil right to marriage, but we will need to ask ourselves very shortly as ethicists, should marriage be limited to 2 and only 2 persons? Or should those persons who have been sent to the margins of our society because they must put together other forms of human sexualities and other pairings or partnerships in order to survive with a matter of dignity, should we not address the nature of intimate relationships and whether or not they will be protected? Then there are the questions like my friends Dick and Patty in California. Patty, once upon a time a lesbian, and this gets me into a lot of trouble when I say this, because she still says she is, and she married Dick, who says that he is bisexual. Wow. I should have stayed in the parish with questions like this. Why does the sex or sexual orientation of intimate partners matter? We're going to have to address that one real soon. And then lastly, I hope some of you got to see the ESPN special a couple of weeks ago. That tells you a little bit about what I like to watch, on Renee Richards, the tennis player who was once upon a time Dr. Richard and now became Renee Richards, and in fact had to fight to be in one of the U.S. Open tennis tournaments, later to become part of Team Navratilova. When we consider issues about not only gays and lesbians, transgendered persons, but transsexual persons and other forms of human sexualities, we will once again and continually come to grips with questions about traditional and essentialist dualistic sex-gender paradigms that reduce complex questions to what makes us comfortable. Ethics is my vocation. I don't necessarily look forward to these questions, but they are the questions, I believe, which God and the Church has put before us. And thank you for highlighting them so well. I'm going to forgo my very complex, obtuse questions to you, and I'm going to pick up questions that we didn't have a chance to ask this morning. The first one is, what does church teaching mean by the term disordered? And why not change this term in the face of scientific evidence pointing toward non-pathological minority variation as a more accurate descriptor?
As I think part of what I was trying to argue is precisely in agreement with that a difference has been defined as a disorder. That is, a difference has been defined as pathological rather than simply recognized as a non-pathological difference, like left-handedness, going back to the Quakers in Britain who first made that analogy. So the Church uses the term disordered, I believe, in reference to what they call the homosexual inclination. And it refers to it not being ordered to procreativity and to a opposite sex partner. So I don't know if that was what. Okay.
Folks wanted to know why not change the term, and I think that you're addressing that.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue in favor of it being changed, and was trying to do that, yeah.
The next question, Patricia, is, will we reach a point when American Catholic bishops decide that allowing homosexuals to marry is preferable to a new social structure that is out of control and out of control of the hands of the church?
Gee, I don't know. I don't know what. Maybe the question is about cutting their losses. That is, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but if you were asking, whoever you are, that the church seems to be increasingly losing its credibility and its influence over sexual conduct and all kinds of forms of conduct, and not making sense to ordinary people, not ringing true in its teachings, especially about the moral life. I don't think that the bishops will cut their losses in this regard soon, because it's not just moral formation that's at stake, it's Episcopal authority as well. And so it's I think as long as our bishops keep being appointed from Rome and not, we're not going to have that kind of shift in the Catholic episcopacy soon.
Thank you. Oh, this is for either one of us. Does the Catholic Church have official teachings that are concerned with bisexuality and transgenderism? There are actually 3 questions here. Does the LGBT affirmation and female ordination go hand in hand? And thirdly, can the Roman Catholic Church excommunicate or discipline LGBT Catholics or Catholic allies? Hey, you know what? I think these are all yours.
Well, let's go. The first was about official teachings. I think the closest thing that we have to naming a transgendered person is a canonical law or just ruling about a man who was ordained and then was transitioning to become a woman in Italy somewhere. And I don't, frankly, do you know the answer to this? You do? I don't. Janine? Go ahead. I'll repeat what you have to say, and then if that helps. Sorry. It's not, I sort of vaguely remember reading.
Well, this isn't that case, but this may have sparked it, that in the Vatican there are papers being circulated that would purport to say that being transgendered is certainly not in line with Catholic teaching. And there have been public, like newspaper accounts about that, but there's been nothing officially released by the Vatican. Right. So far, nothing official.
Right. And the
second one is about, does LGBT affirmation and female ordination go hand in hand?
Well, I think they're interrelated in that both of them question a rigid sense of iconic roles for men and women in the church. So I mentioned to you that part of the way the bishops think about why gay couples can't be these symbolic icons of openness to life is because of this very rigid notion of gender roles. And I think that also informs teaching on women's ordination. So they are interconnected. I don't think a change in one would necessarily lead to an immediate change in the other. But
the last question on this sheet is, can the Roman Catholic Church excommunicate or discipline LGBT people or LGBT Catholics or their allies in the Catholic Church?
I don't believe there's any automatic excommunication at all associated with this issue. So, okay, Janine, just come up. No, it's helpful. I mean,
well, many people here know that I was in trouble,
Right.
with the Vatican, and and my provincial. So this is just a little anecdote. My provincial was very worried that I was going to get excommunicated because I wouldn't give the official party line. And so we were making a trip to the mother house of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, where our foundress was buried, to pray for a miracle. And so while we were on the plane, who was there but Cardinal Ratzinger? So I sat down next to him, and we started to chat, and my provincial chatted, and I have to add this line, even though it's not really relevant, but my provincial said, now, she's a very good sister. But we're very worried that she's going to get excommunicated. Mm-hmm. And he said, because this was right after the Tisa Balasaria incident, who was excommunicated for other things.
Right.
And he said, oh, no. He said, and I took that to mean not agreeing to the Church's teaching on homosexuality, it is not that level of doctrine. So now that was said when he was, at the head of the CDF, but now he's Pope, and I hope he still thinks that.
Right. So the answer was no.
This is also a question from this morning. What is God's responsibility as creator to those people whom the Church characterizes as morally or intrinsically disordered? Yes, I know this term refers to sexual acts of homosexuals. It seems the Creator has predetermined some human beings for failure.
Well, you're the Presbyterian, Joan.
I do have a response to your comment about that, but I won't go there.
Again, I think the kind of official response to that would be that no sexual act is compulsory in the sense of we make choices about whether to engage in sexual behavior or not, regardless of our orientation. I think the toughest version of this question would be something like, has God given the gift of celibacy to everyone who is gay? That is, would God place upon people this, what the official Church calls a heavy burden, right? This inclination that is experienced as a burden without the graces with which to cope. And for me, the fact that all gay people are not given the gift of celibacy is one of the signs that this is not only a burden, this orientation. It's not a disorientation, because I don't think, so I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Let me just make one comment as we close. I would hope that we would extend both you and me and our other ethicists as we write publicly, and for laypersons in all of our churches who are socially active, that we understand that if marriage equality, if we can continue to grow the consensus, we will save a number of both heterosexual and LGBT young people's lives from bullying.
Thank you. Can I make one comment? I did want to respond to Joan's comments about Marvin Ellis, and just for those of you who are familiar with his writings, I would commend them to you. He and I have argued about fidelity a lot, and I'm really conservative, and I've argued with a lot of people in the gay community about the significance of fidelity, and I'm not wanting to make marriage compulsory for those not called to it, but I do think there's a lot of evidence that having two parents really helps children flourish if you want to be involved in parenting. And in terms of spousal partnerships, my own sense is that exclusivity has more to do with approximating doing justice to one another. I can barely love my own partner enough, given all of the rest of my life. I can't imagine trying to do justice to the value and worth of multiple partners. That's my own account. I know that when the church went into places like Africa and said, oh, you can only have one partner and you have to throw away the others, I don't want to commend that to the gay community or say that these people need to be dismissed or ignored or these other important relationships. But there may need to be a time of transition as the gay community, as people move toward more faithful relationships. I don't know if that made sense, but that's part of what I've been trying to talk to people about in the gay community in Kansas City. Thank you.